Story 1. A girl in her final year got pregnant and was hiding it from her parents. She was 18 at the time, though. She went to the counselor, qualified clinical psychologist, who was helping her through it. The counselor walked her through all of her options and did what she was supposed to do. The girl, I think possibly in denial, carried the baby quite far along but then wanted out. She was also starving herself. Long story short, I also can't remember all the exact details. She apparently went to a dodgy clinic where she convinced them she was much earlier in the pregnancy. Guessing they did no tests, and they gave her abortion pills or something like that. Like I said, can't remember the exact deets, so don't crucify me. She started profusely bleeding in class the next day and was rushed to the hospital. The baby survived for about 4 hours and then passed away. Obviously, by this point, her parents were there. Upon questioning, she named our school counselor and said that she had forced her to have an abortion. This whole case went to court. Our poor school counselor couldn't say anything or defend herself publicly until the case was done. We had reporters outside our school gates for ages. It all came out at the end that the girl had lied, and the counselor was completely innocent and had just done what she was supposed to do and had offered the girl all the information and advice for her to make an informed decision. I was amazed at how professional the counselor was and how she did everything by the book when it came to speaking about her client. Anyway, that was crazy. Story 2. A football player with the last name Parham got punished for something and was no longer allowed to walk the stage for graduation. One day, a friend of his pulled up in a truck outside of the cafeteria during lunch, slammed on his brakes, jumped out, and proceeded to sprint inside. He streaked through half the cafeteria with a Spider-Man mask on, and Free Parham painted on his bare butt. Staff tried to grab him and stop him, and despite him literally slipping on a piece of food and falling, he escaped valiantly, as any hero should. Eventually, Parham was once again allowed to walk the stage, although I'm sure the stunt wasn't the only reason for it. Story 3. So this happened yesterday, and it was pretty wild for a Canadian school. At the end of the day, there was a police car at the front of the school. Someone said they saw a kid get arrested when they went to the washroom. At the end of the day, a cop and the principal were standing at both back passenger windows talking to someone inside. We all just assumed that someone was getting arrested for selling drugs or something. The next day, my homeroom teacher told us between the third and fourth period, the 2 afternoon periods in Canada, a former student who was about 20 years old blended in with students and snuck into the school hallways. He wandered through the hallways stealing from unlocked lockers and actually stole about 10 laptops from teachers' classrooms somehow. They ended up catching him at the Tim Hortons down the road. Not sure what's going to happen to him, but someone said his mom was his getaway vehicle a couple blocks down the road. He just had to stop at Timmy's first. Only in Canada do people have to stop for a coffee and a donut mid-robbery. Story 4. 2 guys in my year decided to bring about 50 cabbages into school and start a cabbage fight in the science corridor. All hell broke loose, and cabbage leaves were everywhere. About 100 students joined in. You most certainly can have 100 students and 50 cabbages in a cabbage fight. Check the cabbage fight rulebook. It wasn't a case where 100 students were already there and waiting. The 2 guys just randomly started the cabbage fight at break time, and the students who were already in the corridor began to join in. Cabbage started to break. Other students heard the commotion and then joined in, picking up lumps of cabbage, so on and so forth. Story 5. Some boys in the saxophone section of the marching band made a Christmas card featuring them nude, except for Santa hats and their sacks covering their sacks. They distributed it to the whole band, which at our school was a pretty large number of people. School tried to confiscate them for being lewd, but of course they couldn't get them all. Besides, people had camera phones and Facebook. Story 6. 2 girls were fighting over a boy. They were in the bathroom, in the same stall. While they were fighting, one of the girls took out a pair of scissors and stabbed the other in the eye. The girl who stabbed her was expelled, and the other girl turned out to be just fine and went back to school like everything was normal. The creepy part was, my classroom was the closest one to the bathroom, and we didn't hear anything. We just saw the cops. It creeps me out to think it happened a couple feet away from me. What about her eyes? That doesn't sound very alright to me. Surprisingly enough, there's quite a few instances of times where something like this happens, and when the doctors removed the offending object, they were surprised to see that somehow the eye had just kind of been pushed out of the way and smushed up in the skull with the brain. Not to say that this doesn't F with your eye for a few weeks or months, but similar things have happened. Story 7. One time, this kid I was friends with brought this hot sauce called Da Bomb to school and let a bunch of kids try it during lunch. It's 1.5 million Scoville units, hotter than hell. Some kids really started freaking out because that crap is ridiculously hot. Like, you're supposed to add 1 or 2 drops to a big batch of chili to make it spicy. Some were trying to show off and took a swig of it and then ended up vomiting everywhere from the heat and panic. Multiple kids had to go to the nurse and be sent home because they overdid it. Although I think most just really had no idea what a Scoville unit was, or that they made hot sauce that was that ridiculously hot. It was chaos. I tried it as well, a dime-size amount, and I couldn't concentrate on anything but chugging milk, and I'm really good with spicy foods. Finally, the principal came on the intercom and said, "Whoever brought the hot sauce, please, just stop." My friend got into some pretty big trouble for that one. Story 8. Someone called in a bomb threat to my middle school and elementary school. Instead of evacuating both buildings, we were in lockdown for 3 hours, and they condensed all of us in the middle school. We later evacuated to the high school only like 300 feet away, and were stuck there for hours because our parents couldn't get us. All of our phones were taken because they didn't want us giving information. So there were like 700 white moms in the suburbs simultaneously having a heart attack trying to get to the school. We learned later they called this into almost every school in the area. There was a robbery at a Bank of America while the cops were preoccupied. Story 9. There had been rumors since my freshman year about the assistant principal taking a certain special interest in a few of the girls. Almost everyone wrote it off as high school kids starting stupid rumors. Until my senior year, when 4 police officers came in after school and walked him out in cuffs in front of a few hundred students watching a basketball game against another school. He was doing one of the girls in my grade and selling her oxycodone in the hallways. Got 10 years. Story 10. A guy went into the locker room during gym class and crapped into another guy's backpack. This happened in a German school in 2014 or 15. The guy didn't face any consequences, although almost everyone knew who did it. Our principal pretty much was like, "Yeah, let's not talk about this." The story also spread like a wildfire in our town, and I had friends from different schools text me about it before I even came home that day. Story 11. Senior year, we received our yearbooks the week of graduation, and to our surprise, the full-page action shot for men's soccer showcased our player jumping up and lifting one leg to trap and control the ball. Unfortunately, he forgot to wear underwear that game, and the tip of his wiener was fully visible sticking out of the bottom of his shorts. Our school had over 4,000 students, and we were required to bring our yearbook into security to have the D sharpied over, or we would not be able to walk at graduation. Story 12. It was the last day for the senior class. There was only 2 significant pranks that day. The principal's office was filled with balloons and glitter, and the main hallway entrance was saran-wrapped. About an hour before the day ended, the principal came over the loudspeaker and said that anyone caught participating in a prank would not walk at the graduation ceremony. About a minute after he said this, the fire alarm went off. A guy who was near the principal said that he got angry and said out loud, "Someone is not walking," before storming off. An entire wing of the school was hazy, and smoke was pouring out of a classroom. Turns out the science teacher was doing a laser experiment for his class and created too much smoke with a smoke machine. Story 13. One of the students ditched high school one day and rode his dirt bike really fast in front of the school, popping a wheelie while the school was still in session. He wiped out and slid and hit his head on a light pole and died right in front of the school across the street. Really sad and super crazy. This was in Bakersfield, California. It's crazy how many other places this has happened. Also, no helmet was involved that I'm aware of. A few people have mentioned the light pole. It can also be called a lamppost or light pole. Sheesh. The pole received all kinds of attention after. People writing notes on it, people leaving flowers and lighters and so on. It was really weird. I wouldn't want to be remembered by what killed me, but I think a lot of students didn't have anywhere else to mourn him. Story 14. This happened in grade school, but a moose escaped a local zoo and somehow made its way to our school yard during our recess. We were all rushed inside and the school was put into a lockdown situation until the moose left the yard. Take a wild guess which country I'm from. Anyone who guessed Canada is right. I feel like there's nothing more Canadian than almost getting mowed down by a moose. Story 15. We were all called to an emergency assembly and told a student had died. Her friends were distraught, and even the people who didn't know her went quiet. I think I remember a group of students putting together a type of memorial card. The whole morning was morbid, until the dead girl arrived at school and didn't know what was going on. During my sophomore year of high school, I was on spring break with my family, and we went out of state to a condo for the week. Great trip. I recommend Virginia to anyone looking for a scenic getaway. When we got back from that vacation and I went to school the next Monday, everyone was staring at me like they saw a ghost. I was an introvert in a public school of about 1,200 kids, so it was unnerving. I had girls and guys running up and hugging me, saying they were so glad I was okay. Many of them I didn't really talk to. I was so confused. Come to find out, in the next town over, there was a kid who was struck by a car and killed while we were gone on spring break. His name was identical to mine, except for one letter in his last name. So everyone who saw it naturally assumed they spelled the name wrong because that spelling was a very common mistake with my name. I wouldn't call it the incident for my school, but that day was very memorable, and I had to share it when I saw your similar story. Story 16. This was back in the 70s. In 7th grade, some girl just started groping the boys. If you got close to her, she would immediately grab your groin or butt, whichever was closer. Sometimes she would grab both at the same time. Of course, the boys started groping her back, and it turned into a common thing to do, and she let it happen. The boys then started groping other girls. Some went along with it and thought it was funny. Others got upset and told teachers and the principal. The principal called a big assembly and read the riot act. The girl that started all of it acted shocked and outraged, but the adults knew she was the one that started the whole thing. Story 17. When I was in high school, our high school had a gang called the Cobras who would spray paint cobras on school property, write it on desks, in the bathrooms, basically everywhere. It was dumb, and many of the students had a good idea who was a part of this gang, but the teachers did not. The principal would call down groups for photos in the yearbook, siblings, sport teams, drama club, etc., on overhead announcements, and one day they called down the Cobras for a school photo for the yearbook, to try and figure out who they were. They caught almost half the students who were defacing school property because they showed up for the group photo. Story 18. Gym cooling system overheated and caught on fire during the homecoming parade. That and state police had to show up 2 years ago after an increase of freshman fights in the cafeteria. It got to the point where there were some rumors that school security had to use a taser on one of the kids after a fight to subdue. The rumor was complete BS, and our football team had to cancel a home game and concede the game over potential threats. It was a crappy junior year, 2017-18. Story 19. This wasn't in my high school, but back in middle school, someone got taken to court for bringing vodka to school in water bottles and then selling it to other students. 7th grade. There was also the crazy British kid who got suspended after saying he'd shoot up the school, also in 7th grade. He apparently came back to the school a few months later, but I never met him. On the topic of violence, we also had several anonymous bomb threats left in the Spanish classroom throughout my 8th grade year. Story 20. I was a teacher, and a very good kid just got pushed to his limit by a bully teacher. Had been bullied by this guy for a couple of years. Never did find out what was up with that. So the bully teacher says something to the kid, he runs out to his car, grabs a crowbar, and comes in smashing all the glass he encountered. It was safety glass, but lots of shards anyway. Tries to go after the teacher to kill him. He got trapped in the library. The classroom was located in a small classroom off the library, and I was right next door, keeping kids in their seats and unable to go to the bathroom for about 90 minutes. Cops began arriving from all directions since we were right off 2 state highways. State cops, canine cops, etc. Kid destroyed all the beautiful 1940s oak shelving, the teacher's desk, anything that would break. His mom shows up and disarms him. Kid gets slammed on a stretcher and hauled off to the nearby AFB, where his dad worked. Not sure exactly what all happened there, but he got a lifetime ban from being at the high school, and a serious restraining order from ever contacting or being near the bully teacher. I like the kid. Never once had any bit of trouble with him. Saw him a couple of months later and asked him to please tell me if he was ever mad at me. He laughed. Kid was diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder. Went on to be a good adult. He just kind of lost it that day. I did not know that the kid was being bullied until the crap hit the fan. Then kids told me the whole story. There was nothing I could do except offer words of support to his girlfriend, and then be nice to him when I saw him again. As a victim of lifetime bullying, not school but family, I know the damage it can cause. As far as bullies go, I called them out in my classroom whenever I knew what was going on. But if you know anything about bullies, they tend to do these things at times or places that teachers don't see. We can't stop what we don't witness. Sadly, many victims don't report until the situation has reached critical mass. Story 21. During lunch, if you picked up trash and turned it into the yard attendant, you would get a dime per piece. One kid did it religiously, every single lunch, and was tormented and bullied the whole time. Kids would knock the trash out of his hands, push him over when he picked it up, call him all sorts of names. They were relentless. Then, in junior year, he bought a '66 Mustang. Not an incident really, but I still have respect for that kid. Story 22. Someone I knew tried to call in a bomb threat from a payphone during finals week. This was in the 90s, and nobody took him seriously, and the school found out who it was and suspended him for like a couple of days. I'd imagine now the school would go on lockdown, or just close and not let any students in, since he did it early in the morning. The kid would probably end up getting arrested by a SWAT team with a bomb squad nearby, cost the city a fortune, get jailed, or at least expelled, and their life would be ruined. Yeah, we had a rash of fire alarms my junior year. The principal pleaded for them to stop. One weekend, the school redid all the alarms with that ink that sprays whoever pulls it. Dude got nailed. Charged with a serious crime because he foolishly admitted to pulling like 10 alarms. He spent his Christmas at juvenile hall. Story 23. A girl scratched a guy's face so hard, he got a scar that runs from his forehead to his cheekbone, passing through the eye, almost blinding him, because she felt like kicking his butt. A kid was caught smoking weed in the bathroom several times, because his mother found out he smoked and prohibited him from leaving school during class hours so he couldn't come out and smoke. One Monday, we arrived at the school to find a huge puddle of puke on the floor of the main hall. The Students' Association threw a party the night before, and nobody cleaned it, because they were all either drunk or stoned. After that, no more parties could be hosted at school. They were all hosted at event pavilions outside of school grounds. A girl, 16, got pregnant. When confronted by her parents, she spilled all the beans. She and her boyfriend would wait until almost closing hours, and have sex at secluded corners of the school grounds. When she gave birth, the father dragged the boyfriend to the hospital nursery, placed the baby in his arms, and said, "This is yours. Deal with it." Story 1. In high school, they would do trivia questions after the announcement sometimes, and the first teacher who dialed the office with the correct answer would get a prize for the class. My math teacher really wanted to win, and hadn't yet this year. So one fateful morning, the question went out, and we had the answer, so he called in. But we were the second caller. In a fit of pseudo-rage, he yells, "Damn it!" and kicks this little plastic trash can across the room, where it bonks a kid right in the head. His eyes go wide, and he apologizes and asks if the kid is okay, which he is. Everyone got a good laugh afterwards, including the kid who got hit, and later we would pretend to duck whenever we didn't win the morning trivia contests. Story 2. I had a history teacher in high school who was always stern and serious, which was great since it gave a reverence to what he was teaching about. And his unpretentious nature meant he spoke about what was important and interesting. One day, however, his voice broke, and after he cleared his throat, it broke again. He stopped talking, put his hands in his pockets, frowned, and took a few breaths. "Students, sorry about this lecture. My wife and I just decided to get a divorce. He blankly stared ahead for a second and then walked toward the door, loosening his tie. I need a drink. He exited the door. After a second, he poked his head back in. Of water. I'm coming back. Don't think I've forgotten about Napoleon. Not too much of a meltdown, but he was a pretty manly dude in a nerdy sort of way. Story 3. Our freshman English teacher was a small, soft-spoken woman who was kind of known to be a teacher you could walk all over with little repercussions. We were in a review session after school, and some upperclassmen were just hanging out in the hallways making lots of noise, so she was constantly poking her head out in the hall asking them to be quiet. As we are all very silently reading or something, the classroom door absolutely slammed shut, so hard the latch didn't have time to catch, and the door bounced back open. The teacher immediately yells, "Oh, hell no," and kicks off her heels and takes off out the door. She caught up with the kid, who had taken a running start and kicked the door shut, and berated him for a good 10 minutes, which we could hear clear as day from the end of the hall. It was like nothing we'd ever heard from her. Story 4. I was in a band. One day, one of the regular always in trouble disruptive students was being extra disruptive while the director was trying to tell us something important. So after about 5 different times of going the normal route to get him to settle down, he cracked. It got quiet, and then the director bellowed, "William, are you stupid or just don't give a crap?" The whole room was quiet. All eyes were now on the disruptive kid who was then trying to hide behind his tuba. Then the director continued with his announcement like nothing happened. Story 5. My super dorky history teacher in 8th grade was the nicest teacher I've ever met. But there were a couple class clowns in our class, and he usually dealt with them okay. One day, though, they were obnoxious to the entire class from the moment he walked in, and he snapped, yelling and chucking his stapler across the room. He nailed a staple right into Ben Franklin's forehead. He immediately apologized and went about his day normally, while all the students went silent. Nobody ever bothered him again after that day. Story 6. A Spanish teacher I had in high school ended up having a meltdown on the day of the final exam. The whole semester, my class had been pretty chatty, but really nothing that out of the ordinary. On the day of the final, there was an event that set her off. If I remember correctly, he was talking during the exam. His cell phone may have gone off instead. It's been a while. She proceeded to attempt to pick up the desk with a 17-year-old sitting in it and slam it on the ground. The kid got up, and then she flung the desk along the floor, slamming it against the door, and told him to finish his exam outside. Then she proceeded to tell the rest of us what terrible people and students we were. She also told us that she had gained 20 pounds over the course of the semester because of how bad our class was. Then she felt the need to tell us about how she'd been raped as she broke down sobbing. After that, I just did my best to finish my exam as quickly as possible so that I could go home, as that was my last class of the year before summer. Story 7. Junior year of high school, I decided to take a psychology class. The administration switched a lot of teachers around that year and hired a lot of new ones too, so I didn't know anything about him. As the semester goes on, his behavior starts slipping, and the class starts noticing. He begins to lose his patience more and more frequently when the class doesn't respond to a question immediately. His behavior then progressed to him throwing whiteboard markers at students for not paying attention or answering incorrectly. Then one day, about half the way into the semester, he completely loses it. A group of 3 students laughed at something within their own conversation just as class was starting, and our teacher saw and made a comment to the class that if we weren't going to listen, he would make today hell. Some kid spoke up saying he would go to the principal if he did anything to hurt the class. So the teacher began throwing markers, erasers, anything he could find at the student. The student got up to leave for the principal's, and the teacher stood up on his desk and screamed at us. He ran to the front of the classroom, where the student who spoke out was, picked up a desk and threw it at the student. Thankfully, it didn't hit him, but the teacher ran to the door to prevent anyone from leaving, and said if anyone said anything about that day to anyone, he would ruin their lives. Some friends and I told the principal and administration, and I actually had to go into court to testify. Turns out, the guy suffers from schizophrenia as well as some degree of PTSD after serving in the military. I don't remember what ended up happening with him. At the time, I really didn't care to know. Bummer. I really wanted to hear this end with something like, at the end of the semester, he tied his erratic behavior to a lesson plan. Some kind of dead poet society or something. We had a physics teacher in 11th grade that fake reversed graded the first big exam. All the smart kids did bad, didn't understand why, and the couple broke down. He quickly blended that into the next lesson and handed out the proper grades at the end of the class. Was a total mind F. Story 8. Junior year in university, my genetics professor was in the middle of a lecture when authorities took him out of the auditorium, thank goodness, and informed him that his wife, the dean of our college, had been struck and killed by a motor vehicle that morning. He retreated to his office and proceeded to tear the place apart like a tornado had gone through it. He ripped the top of his desk off its frame, pulled down all of his bookcases, books, pages, papers, all sorts of documents and furniture strewn everywhere in pieces. By the time I graduated, he still wasn't the same man as he was before that awful day. Story 9. This was in high school. We had a band teacher. His nickname was Pinky because he had very red hair and pale skin with a red tint, borderline albino. Every time he got mad, his entire face turned tomato red. I don't remember the sequence of events, but he was already frustrated. Everyone in the room knew to shut up so that we didn't piss him off. Well, everyone except this one dippy girl. She asked something along the lines of, "Are you mad?" and kept pestering him. He finally snapped. His face turned that familiar shade of tomato red, and he threw the pencil he was using to conduct across the room. He then stormed out and slammed the door hard enough that it could be heard on the other side of the building. He quit soon after. Story 10. Year 9 math class. Our teacher was sick and an early 20s substitute teacher came in to cover. She was lovely, kind, friendly, although a bit timid and shy. One girl in our class used a fountain pen to flick ink on a shirt she was wearing one day. Poor woman noticed her do it, didn't say a word, and just went to her desk, put her head in her hands, and sobbed. Didn't even move for 10 minutes at least. Eventually, a friend of mine went to get another teacher. The sub was escorted out, still crying, and was seen for the rest of the day just crying in her car, not moving for another 4 or so hours. Story 11. 8th grade math teacher. He was well known for his short temper, but this particular day was bad. There was a kid in my class, Justin, that never listened and never did his homework. One day, the math teacher just had it with Justin, grabbed his desk with him in it, and picked it up and slammed it back down on the ground a few times. After that, he shoved the desk with Justin in it across the room. Justin was fine, thankfully, but the math teacher just stormed out. Told my mom, and I guess a few other parents called the school about it too. He was gone for a few weeks and had to take anger management classes. I just went by my old middle school a few weeks ago, and he's the assistant principal now. Who would have expected that? Story 12. In high school, our government teacher freaked out on my class. We had a few talkers in the back corner, but they finally broke him. He flipped his podium lectern over and started screaming at us. He called us the worst group of kids he'd ever had to teach, and that he was 110% accurate that we were going to be nothing. He then went to his desk and drank his entire thermos of coffee. A few years later, he was having a retirement party at his house. I was close friends with his son. He revealed that the thermos was 80% vodka and 20% coffee. Story 13. Had a sub in 5th grade. I was a really unorganized kid, and having to dig through my desk for crap wasn't uncommon. Sub went to collect our homework one by one, and I was still digging through, pulling a bunch of stuff out when she got to me. She started towering over me and told me this was unacceptable, dumped my desk in front of me and told me I was staying in from recess to organize it. One girl said, "You can't make him do that." And the sub raised her voice and spit out, "You don't tell me what to do, brat. I can do whatever I want." The whole class revolted, and a neighboring teacher came in to see what was up. The sub claimed I was being lippy, and this was my punishment. Then the whole class spoke up and informed him of what really happened, and we were all let out for recess. Came back in, and a lunch lady was sitting at the teacher's desk instead. As the kid who was always picked on by everyone, it was nice to see the whole class stand up for me that day. Story 14. I taught public high school for 7 years and have been teaching in a university ever since. Every time one of these threads pops up, I expect to find the story of how I once broke down in tears when a cell phone rang in class. Or the time I threw up in a trash can, brushed my teeth with bottled water in front of all 42 students, asked a janitor to come down and take the trash out, and went back to teaching after my favorite student of all time faked barfing noises because he knew it would make me puke. Story 15. My junior year in nursing school, we took a nursing psych class. The professor was not a good teacher, to put it lightly. She regularly would talk about her personal life instead of teaching what was outlined on the syllabus. About halfway through the course, we had our midterm exam, which consisted of about 75% of questions of stuff we had not covered in class. I think the highest grade anyone got was a 65%. The next class, she berated us and told us all we were going to be bad nurses. One of the people in my class wrote a letter to her, saying that she spends most of the classes not teaching the material, and it's not justifiable to give us exams if we know more about her personal life than what we are supposed to be taught, citing the syllabus given to us at the beginning of the semester. All of us in the course signed the letter. Next class, she absolutely lost it on us, screaming at us about how disrespectful we are and how we will never amount to anything. This got to the point that the dean of the nursing program heard her from down the hall and had to come remove her from the classroom. Next class, we had another professor for the rest of the semester. The dean told us she was on hiatus and said that we brought up our grievances in a respectful manner and commended us on that. The professor who broke down never came back to teach at the school. Story 16. I was bullied a lot around this time, and I started fighting back against the bullies. The teacher noticed this and thought it'd be a good idea to remove me, and who is essentially my arch nemesis, from the playground during lunch, and make us do crafts in a classroom instead. I think they were trying to make us get along by working together, but that doesn't happen with 11-year-olds. Unsupervised for a whole hour in a locked classroom. She leaves, and when she returns halfway through the hour, the classroom is a mess, chairs strewn everywhere, our school jumpers and shirts are torn. I had a bleeding ear and he had a swollen lip and bruises everywhere. We freeze as soon as she catches us, and she just collapses to the ground. She sobbed into her hands. "All I wanted was for you to be friends. Was that so much to ask?" She wept uncontrollably for the next 5 minutes. We felt awful about it. We shook hands and tried to clean up the classroom. The next day, we had a substitute teacher, who eventually became our permanent one, and he was horrible. I guess it worked though. It's 16 years later, and I'm on the way to my enemy's house to drink and play board games. So, yeah. Story 17. My 8th grade algebra teacher, also German teacher, Mr. Cogburn, was an interesting guy. He was tall, had kind of wild-looking frizzy gray hair and a beard, and had a sort of boisterous, larger-than-life kind of personality. He started every single class by slamming the door and yelling. He yelled, or as I would realize once I got into theater in high school, he projected, through the entire class period, though he never really came across as intimidating. He always had a yardstick in his hand that he would slap forcefully against the blackboard to emphasize what he was saying. He would also slap it against the desks of students who weren't paying attention, though he was exceedingly careful to not actually hit the student. It wasn't terribly uncommon for him to break yardsticks, and there was always another one in the supply cabinet to replace the one he'd broken. He had a little song/chant he made up for remembering the slope-intercept form of an equation for a line that I will probably remember until the day I die. He also gave the most effective, and to 8th graders both hilarious and embarrassing, explanation of how to divide fractions. He stood on a desk and told us, "Always divide the top." He pointed at his head. "By the bottom." He then turned around and pointed at his own ass. "Never divide the bottom, because the bottom," here he helpfully gestured up and down the length of his ass, "is already divided." That's what Mr. Cogburn was like. He was big and loud and crazy, but not in a scary way. We told new students that the way to tell he was actually mad was if he started the class by shutting the door like a normal person and speaking quietly, and that was when they should be scared. Now we get to the story of the meltdown. Every year, our school did an event called the Mathathon. Students were given math worksheets and tried to solve as many problems as they could in a set amount of time. People, usually the parents, would sponsor the students, pledging a certain amount of money for each problem correctly solved, and at the end, the money was donated to a local charity that helps the disabled. It was that time of year, and Mr. Cogburn was explaining the mathathon to my class. And when he got to the part about the charity and what they did, one boy, who probably thought himself incredibly cool and edgy, loudly said, "I don't know why anyone bothers to help those tards. We should just let them all die." And Mr. Cogburn transformed. As I said before, dude was tall, well over 6 feet, but his height never came across as imposing at all. Now, he loomed over that student's desk like the freaking angel of death. He seemed to physically radiate pure rage. I swear to all that's holy, you could feel his outrage coming off of him in waves. Even though he was focused solely on the one boy, students halfway across the room sank down in their chairs in pure terror, trying to disappear under their desks. I know because I was one of them. We couldn't even look at him, not out of the usual crap he's mad, don't make eye contact instinct most people have, but more like it was a form of physical protection. He was a burning sun of anger, and if we looked directly at that sun, it would blind us. He spoke very, very quietly to the boy for about a minute. I didn't make out what he said. Then he led the kid out of the room and shut the door. About a quarter of the class started crying as soon as he left. After a while, the other math teacher came in and taught for the rest of the period. What we all found out later, and which none of us, including that boy, had known, was that Mr. Cogburn's daughter, who he spoke about to us frequently enough, was not his only child. He and his wife had also had a son that was born extremely physically disabled, and who had died at a very young age from health complications arising from those disabilities. When he took that student out of the room, I think we all thought that he was going to kill him. He actually just took him down to the principal and explained what the kid had said, and the kid was suspended for a day. Mr. Cogburn also took the rest of the day off. So that was the biggest meltdown I have ever seen from a teacher, and it was sort of the inverse of a normal meltdown. When he was shouting, gesticulating wildly, and hitting our desks with yardsticks, we loved the guy and feared nothing. But that day when he got so quiet, we felt mortal effing terror.